Hey, folks, it's Rick Wilson. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Lunch with Lincoln, our twice weekly live show where we bring in some interesting folks from around the Lincoln Project team and around the country to talk about things that are of interest to you and us. And today we're talking with my friend Jennifer Harris, who is a public affairs and political consultant down in Texas. As you guys are all well aware, Texas is doing its very best to rival Florida right now. For the crown of the weirdest, crankiest state with the weirdest, crankiest governor. So Jennifer, welcome to Lunch with Lincoln. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you, Rick, for having me. It's absolutely a pleasure. And you're right. I mean, when you approached me about joining you today, I thought we could fill much more than 30 minutes. And you're right. There's a lot of hold my beer going on between Florida and Texas these days.
Right. Yeah. Well, watch this. Well, let me start out with Greg Abbott. I know you know that we've been pounding away at Greg Abbott for the last few weeks here at the Lincoln Project, and we've rattled his cage. We've rattled his consultant David Carney's cage a good bit. And I don't know if I'm just doing confirmation bias, but it seems to me that he's been racing out to the right since we started hitting him to protect himself from Don Huffines and maybe even Allen West on his right flank by doing things like announcing this ridiculous voter fraud investigation, talking about the border again, and basically like going out as far as he can to keep Trump happy. What are you seeing on the ground out there on that front?
Well, I think you nailed it. It's always a bad story or a bad hit or some pressure being put on him, whether it's by the Lincoln Project or Democrats around the state. And, you know, the knee-jerk reaction is to distract and find something to try to change the narrative. I mean, classic, political communication skills that he has. And he's reasonably effective at it. But I mean, I think people are growing a little weary of the distraction from the core issues. I mean, all along, we've been in session now, rolling into a 10th month. And this is a legislature that typically only convenes, every other year for 140 days. So I think the longer that we keep talking about the problems, whether it's the grid and the freeze that we had that killed hundreds of people, or COVID and the horrible number of deaths that we've seen here in Texas, and just the controversies over masks and testing and everything else, the more these things play out, either through special sessions or in the media, it's harming him. I mean, obviously the poll that came out that's saying 51% don't believe he should be reelected. It even caught me a little bit by surprise, but things are certainly catching up with him in terms of the negatives.
I think that's one thing that 2 points you made, they're a little bit tired of it. I think a lot of people who watch Greg Abbott for many, many, many years slowly rise up the ranks in Texas politics. This guy used to be sort of a Bush-style Republican. Used to sort of be a, nuts and bolts kind of guy. Let's make the trains run on time. Let's not go crazy. Conservative by every stretch, but not a lunatic. And it strikes me that that's one of the things that has been really sort of wedging him now, is he's having to go further and further and further out onto that Trump side of the cliff, which isn't about conservatism anymore. It's about making Trump happy and about this like immediate use of power all the time. So in that regard, I've done a little bit of politics in Texas. I've done some campaigning there. I've done a lot of speaking and work there. I've always observed in Texas, there is a demographic of educated Republican women in the Houston, Dallas, and Austin suburbs who are not as far to the right as their Republican counterparts in their marriages. How do you think those folks who make up a big, block of Texas politics, how do you think they're reacting to the abortion snitch bill? Because I think that is something that is big.
Well, no, and I think it's a classic case of bridge too far. They went one too many steps beyond, I think, what might have been tolerated even by Republican women or former Republican women. But yeah, whether you're looking at sort of the polling numbers on the abortion bill issue or just a lot of the chatter online, I do. It's once again, you're seeing women kind of taking center stage in terms of pushing back, and it's not just the liberal women or the Democrats. I mean, I think again, it's a bridge too far to say rape and incest in particular are also from all of this. That's the Republican sort of party or exceptions that I grew up in.
No, well, that was the old Bush rule. That was the old Bush rule of he opposed abortion, but with clear exceptions for rape, incest, and the life of the mother. And now it's not just that, it's using the power of the state to reward people for snitching and spying on women as they try to get an abortion.
Well, and I've worked in lawsuit reform issues and things in politics over the years. And so, yeah, what also jumps out at me practically was, beyond the heart-wrenching stories you hear in terms of the places and positions it puts women in, is the fact that, again, it's very anti-conservative and anti-Republican in a lawsuit reform sort of way. I mean, the frivolous suits that are going to come out from this and the costs involved in all that is mind-boggling.
It really, I think the doctrine of unintended consequences is going to play out here in a pretty meaningful way. So one thing that I was talking to Matt Dowd last night, we'll talk about Matt in a second. We were talking to Matt Dowd last night, and he said that, one of the things the legislature has managed to pass is a bill that's going to basically protect the utilities if they have another freeze in the dark event this winter. I think that's kind of an issue that's like an iceberg out there, that Abbott and his team have not processed. That's something that really pissed off a lot of Texans, and they're not quite.
Killed a lot of Texans. Yeah.
Yeah, killed a lot of Texans. Yeah.
It did.
I'd rather be pissed off than dead, but
Right. But it's like, I know people, like my father, who is elderly and was without power and water for nearly a week. Sure. And, literally put his life on the line, and I couldn't get to him. So, it was, even if it didn't kill you, it was very real for everybody living here through that. And it's interesting. It's classic in terms of, obviously, oil and gas is big here. And so those interests play a big part in what does or doesn't get reformed. I think it's interesting. There was a hearing in the past week in the Senate where there was a lot of surprise and shock that, weatherization wasn't happening, and things that we thought were going to address this issue hadn't been, and really grilling agency folks at the Railroad Commission that, have a responsibility in this space to address it, and like outrage from the senators when, they're the ones that passed the bill. They're the ones that created this, do nothing policy.
Let me ask you this question, because I am, I'm not as much of a student of Texas as you are, but, speaking of our friend Matt Dowd, he's announced he's going to run for lieutenant governor. And I think it's a really interesting proposition as somebody who understands that office and could provide a counterweight. What do you think about that campaign? I'm a friend of Matt. I mean, full disclosure, he's a great guy. I think he's one of the best people I know. And I'm fascinated by your thoughts on him getting in the race. I think it's actually good for the Texas Democrats.
Well, likewise. And I'll preface it with saying I'm a little biased too, because I consider him a friend and certainly have known him for a number of years. But no, it helps. First and foremost, I mean, even as the former Republican that I am, talking with Democrat friends and all here in Austin and around the state, there's a lot of people that were getting a little antsy and a little worried about, where are your candidates, for governor or lieutenant governor on down the ballot. So in that sense, I mean, thank God for Matt getting in that sense, to actually have somebody that's ready to jump in and make the case for a change in leadership from fairly high up the ballot.
Campaigns.
And that does know a thing or two, which I think he's spot on in terms of, going back to his old roots in the Democratic Party. There's no shame in doing that right now, because honestly, it's got to be, sort of this big tent and coalition of the willing to really shift things here in Texas. Kudos to him. And you're right. I mean, obviously, somebody that's worked campaigns, he's not going to jump into it if he doesn't, see a path forward, I think.
I just hope the Texas Democrats, broadly speaking, can avoid all the culture war traps that normally are laid for them on all the silliness on critical race theory and Antifa and guns and abortion and the border. If they can avoid those traps and campaign on some things that actually are meaningful and that show both the overreach and the failure modes of Abbott and his cronies, I think they've got a better shot at this than a lot of people give them credit for right now.
No, I agree. But they do need candidates, and they need to be, sometimes I get frustrated with
Understood.
Democrats' ability to seemingly run it into the ground or miss this big opportunity. But, this is definitely more of a moment than they've ever had. I mean, certainly with Beto coming so close to beating Ted Cruz, and we had a couple of other down ballot races that were pretty tight for Paxton and even for Dan Patrick the last cycle. But still, I think in terms of sort of crystallizing in a moment, whether you're talking about because of everything that's happened with COVID, or the freeze, and a lot of the other culture war battles that are going on in the abortion bill, as far as that hits women, there is just a mountain to run against, a mountain of reasons why, if you talk values and you reorient folks and remind folks of
Right.
what has gone on, I think they
Well,
do have a chance.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think about the idea of? I mean, Dan Patrick is one of the least likable people in politics, not just in Texas. I mean, nationally as well. I mean, and considering he's in that rank, even with Ted Cruz in the mix, who's sort of like the Mount Olympus of unlikable.
Right.
But I'm fascinated by the idea that, you know, Dan Patrick, if Matt beats Dan Patrick, he changes the ball game there. And I think I said this to Matt last night, is one of the things you've got to educate people on how powerful the lieutenant governor is in Texas. It's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think Matt outright said it in his opening video or some of the interviews he first did. It is the most powerful office. The governor over the years has amassed more power and changed some things in terms of the appointments and the influence he has over agencies. But at the end of the day, in terms of a legislative agenda and what is or isn't going to be taken up, it's the lieutenant governor, and to a varying extent, depending on who the speaker is and how strong they are, they can kind of be a check on Dan Patrick. But no, it's the lieutenant governor that drives the agenda. I mean, just in the past 24 hours, we've had the governor pushed to add an election issue back into the special session that we're in right now. It's coming from that very far right flank. So yes, until that changes, the agenda and the nature and tone of the legislature, I don't think will change either.
So I don't know if you've been following this or not. I'm curious about how the redistricting stuff is starting to look in Texas. I have not followed the story very closely, but I was curious if you had any insights on where that is right now. Because at the state level, the Democrats were closing the gap in the House for a long time. I'm curious if the Republicans are about to blow that out in the state House.
I think the maps that came out yesterday on the House side, certainly they have done, and not surprisingly, all they could to shore up Republican members. And, what strikes me as, again, a bridge too far, the changing demographics in the state as what they are clearly not at all reflected in the maps as far as the Hispanic population or, Black Texans and things like that. And so once again, and it's not the first time, though. I mean, as hyper polarized as things are here now, at the end of the day, we've been through redistricting before. It always lands in the courts.
Sure.
It's certainly, there's no reason to think, based on, a first look at these maps right now, that it won't land, it'll be right back in the courts again.
So let me take a question from our Twitter audience. How do I identify the next Stacey Abrams in other flippable red states like Texas? I want to genuinely support effective grassroots organizations. Good question. What do you think, Jennifer?
Well, I mean, I will give Beto credit for that. He has done a lot on his own through the Powered by the People effort to register folks and to try to turn folks out. Whether he runs again and he just stands that operation fully, there's organizations like Move Texas here that have made some good progress. I think at the end of the day is how well they all sort of coordinate or communicate, or if there is one that sort of rises to the top of a Stacey Abrams level. So I don't know. I'd be curious too, Rick, to hear what you have to say in terms of your perspective on it.
There's a lot of stuff out there in the world right now where if a super PAC is based out of Washington, D.C., they're going to do one thing. They're going to raise a lot of money and put all of it on television at the very last part of the campaign. Yep. We didn't do that in 2020. We did more digital than TV ad buying in 2020 because we wanted to target more closely. We didn't go out and try to boil the ocean, as we said at the Lincoln Project. We tried to do what we're good at, our lane of disruptive communications, narrative resetting communications, psychological warfare against the bad guys in their campaigns, and drilling down into what we do. Now, did we make alliances and go out and help other people? Absolutely. Because when a group of Black pastors from Philadelphia called us and said, we can't get the Biden campaign on the phone, we can't get the DNC on the phone, we want to turn out voters in Center City, Philadelphia, can you help us? We said, where do we send the wire? Where do we send the check? We'll do it tomorrow. We're working with a voter registration group now down in Florida that's finally registering Puerto Ricans and Hispanic voters in Florida, finally. And so, I'm sure there are going to be groups that emerge like that in Texas. The more outside of the beltway they are, the better off you'll be. So
I know, I tend to agree. And I think too, here, what has to happen, I realize we've all got our primary battles to wage,
sure.
but, I'm hopeful that the Democrats put together a good enough ticket, top to bottom, that appreciates the fact and the need to bring these crossover voters and sort of the purple and disgruntled Republicans and the like, and the suburban moms, across
Yeah, I
the
mean,
line.
and you know this. Our model was named weirdly by Steve Bannon, who really
Right.
hates us. The Bannon line of voters is 3 to 8% in any election of persuadable Republican voters, and that could mean the difference between between a Republican governor and a Democratic governor, a Republican lieutenant governor, Democratic lieutenant governor. It could mean the difference in the control of this Texas State House. Senate's probably not in reach, but State House is if we could turn those people out, or groups can turn those people out, there's a real possibility there. It's an uphill climb, but
Sure.
it's Everest. You want to go after Everest, because if you can climb Everest, you can climb anything else.
So true.
Let me ask another question from the audience here. Linda asks, I live in Texas. What can be done to ever turn Texas blue? Republicans gerrymandering voting districts that do not reflect the population increase by Hispanics and Blacks. Well, I wish I had seen that question a minute ago, but we answered it a little bit. And look, let me say this, and I tell Democrats this a lot, and this is some tough love. Go register more fucking voters. Go register more voters. Go register more voters. And a lot of times, Democrats are like, oh, they'll just come to us because of this or that ethnicity, or this or that, culture, or this or that, background. No. Go register more voters. It's important to register voters. I mean, and I think
because the Republicans are doing it, and they're very, very good at that. We have been
very good
excellent at that for years, and Abbott in particular is excellent at that, and they're not stopping. So nor can the other side.
Right. They will believe me. Once, and folks, we know this as former Republicans. Once there's a tool that works, we will use it until it breaks the world. We will never stop using a tool that works. And so they're registering a lot of voters. And so it's incumbent upon Democrats to get out there and not be lazy about it. I'll give you one more piece of tough love, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, Jennifer. Democrats are wondering, like, how did we lose the Rio Grande Valley? Why aren't we competitive in the Rio Grande Valley? Well, folks, Democrats look at the Rio Grande Valley and they see a lot of Hispanic voters, one gen, two gen, Mexican Americans. They think they're Mexican Americans, they're Hispanic, they must be with us. They're not. There's a cultural difference between those voters and the Democratic voters in the suburbs of Houston, Dallas, and Austin. A big demographic difference. They are culturally more conservative. They are economically very much in line with the Democrats. They are culturally much more in line with the Republicans. So if you either have to go get them and persuade them and not scare the shit out of them, or you're going to cede them to the Republicans. That's my tough love of the day. We actually have a new ad that mentions Greg Abbott a little bit. It's from and frankly, it came out of the formidable Lincoln women. So let's go ahead and roll that. If we can roll that in the Brand, if you could pop that up there.
We know who you are. We've seen what you've done. And we know how far you'll go to take away our votes, take away our right to protest, to put our parents, kids, and families at risk again from COVID, to have spies and snitches report and harass women making the most difficult choice of their lives. You've won a few rounds, but we know who you are. And you should know who we are. We're tens of millions of American women of every party, race, and creed. We broke you in 2018. We ended Trump in 2020. This election is a fight between people who believe in freedom and men who want to legislate it away. We're mad as hell and cold as ice. We're coming for you.
Bravo. Another good one.
It's my number one rule. Never ever mess with the women of the Lincoln Project. Well, I think we're in a position where nationalizing this election in 2020 is what Democrats really, really need to get to, and quickly, or 2022. Good Lord. In 2022, they really need to get to that as quickly as they can. And I truly believe that in a lot of ways, while the Texas while the moves in Texas to restrict voting rights and speech rights and now women's rights, I think that bridge too far may have been crossed, and I think it's going to be an interesting political dynamic going forward. What else are you following, Jennifer, before we wrap up? What else has got your interest in Texas that we should know about?
Well, I think along the lines you've listed off kind of a litany of issues and things, but I think the public education vote and moms, again, parents in particular, I think may drive some influence and some crossover as well. I know there's a lot of frustration in me as a parent as well, in terms of all that we've been through these past 18 months. And so, yeah, there's the CRT battles and the mask battles and all that, but there's also just the keep our kids safe, fund our schools properly, get them back into school in person, do the right things by the future generation of Texas. And again, I think that's just one of those issues that, yes, it's been talked about in terms of, the school board fights over masks and CRT, but it's really even goes beyond that. And I think you've seen some efforts in the past by the education community, block voting and trying to mobilize, within those networks of PTAs or school board members and their constituencies. And so, I think that's another potential sort of sleeping giant or group that could really hold some sway over things and that are frustrated, whether it's with the governor or with the lieutenant governor as well, because we're waging a lot of the same battles even beyond COVID in terms of school funding here.
Right. I think that's a really good observation. Well, it is also, I think relevant to from Texas and beyond that COVID and the mask mandates has really, that's wrapped up in all the school stuff. And I don't know how it's going over in Texas, but it's going over in Florida with parents and teachers and school folks like a wet fart. It is a bad look on Ron DeSantis. I presume it's hitting Abbott in the same way.
No, absolutely. And it's just so frustrating. And as a parent, it can be very confusing. You really literally have now all these competing lawsuits and school districts doing different things and feeling all this competing pressure, and Abbott really trying to put that heavy hand of no masks down.
Right.
And it's every bit as bad, I think, as what you're dealing with in Florida on that particular topic. So.
Well, at least you may have Dan Patrick, but we have Matt Gaetz. So I'll see you and raise you. Well, Jennifer, thank you so very much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Rick.
Thank you so much.